He built something to save his grandmother's life, but they called him a fraud on national television. And the man who humiliated him had no idea. He just gave a gay boy from the wrong zip code a reason to bring down his empire. Julian West was 13 when his world shrank into a hospital corridor. He stood outside the emergency room, clutching his backpack, hearing nothing but the dull rhythm of machines. His mother had collapsed at work 2 weeks prior, undiagnosed heart failure. No one got there in time, no alerts, no warnings, just silence. And then, a funeral. He moved in with his grandmother, after that, into a row house in a forgotten corner of Baltimore. The kind of place where sirens were the neighborhood lullaby, and healthcare was a privilege no one could afford to imagine. But Julian had something most boys didn't. He had code. At night, when the house was still and the pain had nowhere to hide, he taught himself machine learning. He studied cardiac signals, emergency response gaps, remote sensors. For weeks, he soldered wires with trembling fingers, fueled by grief and too much instant coffee. Then, quietly, he created Helix, a tiny AI-powered device that monitored heart activity, predicted attacks, and sent alerts directly to caregivers and hospitals. All of it. For his grandmother. He didn't build it to win. He built it so no one else would lose. When he submitted Helix to the National Young Inventors Showcase, hosted by Hargrave Tech, he didn't expect to even make the shortlist. But somehow he did. And then he was flown to New York. Television crews, spotlights, a stage that made his palms sweat. The only finalist without a private lab, without a school district that could afford a robotics club, the only one who coded on a second-hand Chromebook and tested his prototypes in a library bathroom. The final round was broadcast live, hosted by Victor Hargrave himself, billionaire CEO, philanthropist, and self-made tech genius. He walked the stage like he owned the future. Maybe he did. Julian stood under the lights, holding Helix like it was the last real thing in the world. He spoke with quiet conviction, explaining the problem, the code, the people it could save. The judges clapped, the cameras panned. It all felt like maybe, just maybe, the world might listen. Until it didn't. Victor Hargrave took the certificate from the host's hand. He smiled, then, with calm precision, tore it in half. "This," he said, holding the pieces high, "is what happens when we lower standards." Laughter rippled across the studio. The audience watched, uncertain, confused. A woman gasped. The judges shifted in their seats, eyes flickering toward the stage but mouths shut tight. The cameras stayed rolling. No one said a word. Julian didn't cry. His throat burned, but his hands didn't shake. He tucked the remnants of the certificate under his arm, nodded once, and walked off stage. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he rewound every frame, every word. He opened Helix's code again. But this time, it wasn't just about grandma anymore. It was about all the voices like his, dismissed before they even spoke. It was about a system that called him inferior, not because of his idea, but because of his zip code, his family, his queerness, his silence. He wasn't going to break in. He was going to break through. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice, and he had 12 days to make the world listen. If you believe one voice can still shake a system, even if it trembles, subscribe to Heart Story, because some kids aren't just survivors. They're architects of change in silence. It was never the end of their story. Julian West didn't sleep much after that broadcast. He sat at the edge of his bed in Baltimore, eyes locked to the flickering light of his monitor, scrolling through the replay of the competition. Every pause, every frame, every word Victor Hargrave said. He wasn't looking for an apology. He was looking for a pattern. It started as instinct, a tug in the gut that something wasn't just cruel, but calculated. The cadence of Victor's dismissal felt rehearsed, like a man who already knew what he would say, no matter who stood in front of him. 2 days later, Julian's instincts found something real. He was combing through patent registries when he saw it, a device filed under HTX Medical Innovations, a subsidiary of Hargrave Tech. Its name was different, but its core functions mirrored Helix biometric tracking, emergency prediction, AI-based triage protocols. Except this version came with a modification, an eligibility layer tied to medical insurance algorithms. Julian's breath caught. It wasn't just that Hargrave had stolen his idea, it was that they'd warped it. They'd turned a tool meant to save into one that decided who got saved and who didn't. He dug deeper. The AI model powering their system wasn't just flawed, it was brutal. It used socioeconomic data as a gatekeeper, denying emergency alerts to patients in low-income neighborhoods, citing low predicted survival benefit as justification. Entire zip code ditches were deprioritized. Quietly, systematically, he couldn't fight this alone. But help came from an unexpected place. Miss Dahlia, the part-time librarian from his neighborhood, had noticed Julian spending hours at the research terminal. She wasn't just a woman with thick glasses and a cardigan that smelled faintly of old books. She used to be Dr. Dahlia Reiner, a former AI ethics professor in Germany, denied license renewal in the US because her qualifications didn't translate. Julian showed her what he'd found. She didn't blink. She leaned in. Together, they traced the algorithm's development history and found whispers of internal dissent. A name surfaced again and again in old news: Dr. Elaine Wright, once the director of ethics at Hargrave Tech, who had resigned suddenly 4 years earlier. No interviews, no statements. They found her living in silence outside Pittsburgh, far from the cameras and headlines. At first, she refused to speak. But when Julian showed her how Hargrave's version of Helix was already denying treatment to patients like his grandmother, she cracked. She gave them access to confidential documentation, board memos, email threads, deployment records, pilot test results, scrubbed from public access. Now they had evidence, but evidence needed a stage. Julian knew he couldn't return to the same competition under his real name. The system had already marked him, but there was no rule against first-time applicants from new institutions. So he created one, a fictitious school, a new applicant ID, and a new name, Jules Wren, the kind of name that wouldn't raise flags, with a new build of Helix and Dr. Wright's proof encrypted inside. He submitted again to a sister showcase broadcast by the same tech network. This time, not just as a boy with an idea, but as a whistleblower with a mission. Victor Hargrave would be there again. So would the cameras. So would the lie. But this time, Julian wouldn't be alone. He had Ms. Dahlia watching his back, Dr. Wright clearing the path, and a silent promise to every person who had ever been told they were too poor to matter. They didn't just steal from a poor gay boy. They stole hope from millions. And he was about to make them pay. Because sometimes, systems don't break. They're designed to hurt. And if no one rewrites the algorithm, it keeps deciding who lives and who gets forgotten. To stand on that stage again, Julian West needed more than proof. He needed permission. The rules of the new showcase were clear. No minor could participate without a legal guardian's consent. And he had none. His grandmother, the only person left in the world who loved him unconditionally, wasn't legally recognized as a guardian. She hadn't been able to adopt him after his mother died. Not with her income, not in their neighborhood, not with a system that turned custody into a bureaucratic fortress. Julian looked over at her as she slept on the couch beside the blinking Helix device. He had spent nights reprogramming it, fixing its sensors, refining its warnings, not just to win, but to prove that the future didn't have to be cruel. But no papers meant no stage. He brought his laptop to the library the next day, ready to pull out. That's when Ms. Dahlia made her decision. She sat beside him, sliding over a sealed envelope. Inside it was a forged document, a guardianship declaration, with her name. Julian stared at it in stunned silence. She didn't speak right away. Then, without meeting his eyes, she said, "My daughter died 4 years ago. Her cancer was caught too late. The Hargrave system flagged her insurance as low impact. She was 22. Her name was Liana. He didn't know what to say. She was queer, like you, Ms. Dahlia added, her voice flat but steady. And no one listened to her either. Julian took a long breath. That night, they printed the final version of the Helix presentation, one that didn't just demonstrate a device, but revealed the truth behind the data. Proof that Hargrave Tech had modified the code to discriminate, filter, and discard. Evidence buried in back-end logs, algorithm audits, anonymized medical trials. But Julian couldn't walk into that studio with a file folder. He needed to make people feel what the code was doing, not just understand it. That's when Amara stepped in. Amara was a young journalist, sharp and tireless, who ran a blog for the queer youth community. She had read Julian's anonymous online posts and traced them back to his school district. She showed up at the library one afternoon with a camera, a portable mic, and a battered notebook filled with years of silent stories. She didn't want the spotlight. She wanted to help him aim it. Together, they planned to reveal during the live broadcast Julian would walk onto the stage as Jules Wren, but instead of giving the expected pitch, he'd hijack the system, use Helix to broadcast the data in real time, cut through the noise, force the truth onto the record. It was bold, it was dangerous, but it was the only way. They had everything they needed until Helix sounded its first real warning. Julian was at the pharmacy with his grandmother when her vitals dropped. The device blinked crimson. He helped her sit. Her breath was shallow. He called emergency services, gave them her history, gave them the data, gave them everything. But the hospital didn't approve immediate intake. The system said she wasn't critical enough. A glitch, they called it. But Julian knew better. Helix had predicted this moment days earlier. He had tried to adjust her dosage, tried to warn her doctor, but without formal insurance approval. There were no referrals, no specialist, no operating room. She lay in the hospital bed that night, stable but not improving. Julian watched the ceiling above her, then looked down at the lines of code that had once felt like a gift. Now it was a weapon. This wasn't just a science project anymore. This was survival. Injustice doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a gun. Sometimes it's written in syntax, hidden in formulas, normalized through decisions no one remembers making. And it's not enough to be right. You have to be louder than the silence that protects the wrong. The lights were just as bright as he remembered, the stage just as cold, the cameras even sharper. But Julian West wasn't the same. He walked out under the name Wren or Thaftin. Guavram, wearing the regulation lanyard, the press shirt, the badge of a fictitious academy that had no building, no faculty, no history, only an idea powerful enough to bring him back here. Behind the curtain, Ms. Dahlia waited near the exit, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. Amara stood beside the tech booth, holding her breath as her camera synced to Helix's broadcast feed. And in the front row, right where the lights curved into shadow, Victor Hargrave sat in judgment again, unmoved, unbothered. But this time, Julian had written the script. He placed Helix on the pedestal, sleeker now, smaller, a new design hiding old truths. The audience expected another pitch, a story about invention, innovation, ambition, something clean and linear. Instead, Julian tapped a single key. The projection screen behind him flickered, then bloomed to life. But it wasn't a demo. It was real-time data, evidence, flagged documents, patient logs, algorithmic thresholds, predictive denials, and one name repeated over and over in the system's rejection queue: low priority, zip 22123. His grandmother's zip code. The audience sat frozen. A judge leaned forward. A producer offstage motioned for the camera to cut. But Amara had already locked the feed into a parallel stream. The lights didn't go off. The sound didn't cut. The nation watched. Julian didn't shout. He didn't perform. He simply explained, clearly, methodically, what the system did, how it didn't just sort data, it sorted lives, how it weighted survival not by medical need, but by income history, racial profiling, geography, and how that wasn't an accident. It was design. Then, he paused. From his pocket, he pulled a second device, an override key built into Helix. It linked directly to the studio's teleprompter system, a quiet little vulnerability Victor Hargrave's team had never bothered to patch, because no one ever expected a teenage coder from Baltimore to find it. The screen behind the cameras began to scroll. Victor Hargrave blinked. The words appearing on his prompter weren't his own. "I apologize, I knowingly endorsed an algorithm that caused preventable deaths. I manipulated national health priorities. I ridiculed a child's invention, and I was wrong." Victor tried to stop reading. His lips fought the lines, but the world was already watching. The words weren't coming from him. They were coming through him. A voice he tried to erase now echoed back in the language of confession. And then, a ripple in the plan. Dr. Elaine Wright stepped onto the stage. She wasn't scheduled to appear. She wasn't in the program, but she walked with purpose, took the mic, and spoke with "My daughter died in a clinic hallway. She was flagged as unfit for escalation. Her final report listed resource misallocation as the reason for delay. I helped build the framework that enabled that decision, and I resigned when they told me it was efficient." The room was silent. Cameras zoomed in, not on Julian, not on Hargrave, but on her face. Victor Hargrave tried to stand, but his feet stuck fast to the glossy stage floor. Seconds earlier, a technician had been sent to clean the space where Julian would stand, but Julian had swapped it, coating the floor beneath Hargrave's chair with a transparent adhesive polymer. Not enough to trap him, just enough to delay him, just enough to hold him still. While the truth moved, the broadcast continued. Even as Hargrave yelled for it to stop, the signal carried through Amara's linked stream. It spread across news sites, student forums, advocacy groups. No press release could spin it. No lawyer could redact it. Julian stood center stage, not with applause behind him, but with a wound laid bare in front of the world. They had given him a microphone. They had given him a camera, but they didn't know. He had rewritten the script. Sometimes, justice isn't loud. It's precise. It doesn't always arrive wrapped in applause or headlines. Sometimes it shows up in syntax, delivered line by line, until even the most powerful can't hide from what they've written. The fallout didn't wait for morning. Within hours, Hargrave Tech's name trended alongside words it had never planned to embrace: fraud, algorithmic genocide, corporate manslaughter. The board of directors issued a statement that said everything and nothing, but the world had already made up its mind. Cameras replayed the moment Victor Hargrave was forced to read his own confession. Journalists dissected the silence that followed Dr. Elaine Wright's admission. And somewhere amid the noise, people began to notice something quieter. A new name whispered across blogs and underground forums: Jules Wren. It didn't take long for the identity behind that name to surface. Julian West was 13, gay, from a neighborhood most maps skipped, with no formal education in artificial intelligence beyond library books and a busted laptop. But he had dismantled the public image of a billion-dollar company, not with protests or lawsuits, but with proof. Hargrave Tech's stock plummeted. Investors fled. Class action lawsuits mounted. The government opened a full-scale ethics investigation into every AI-powered medical tool the company had ever deployed. Victor Hargrave resigned 2 days later, but Julian wasn't in the headlines anymore. He was back in Baltimore, beside his grandmother's hospital bed, watching the alert monitor as it blinked, not in warning, but in rhythm with her heartbeat. Her treatment had been approved within 12 hours of the broadcast. Critical priority, the note said. Julian didn't smile. He just held her hand, knowing it shouldn't have taken a scandal to earn her care. Weeks passed, And then something happened that no algorithm could have predicted. A letter arrived from the National Institute for Ethical AI, a full scholarship, housing, equipment, mentorship, a path, finally, not built on survival, but on purpose. He accepted, but Julian didn't leave everything behind. With Miss Dahlia, he opened a small after-school lab in the back of the library, the same corner where Helix had once been born. There were no desks, no air conditioning, just folding chairs, secondhand keyboards, and a cracked whiteboard. But every afternoon, kids came, queer kids, black kids, kids in foster care, kids who were told they'd never be enough. Julian taught them code, taught them to ask why, taught them how systems aren't neutral. They reflect the values of those who build them. He never called himself a teacher. He just shared what he had learned, that data isn't truth unless someone's willing to question who collects it, who benefits from it, and who gets erased. And then came the final twist. After months of public hearings, regulatory debates, and ethical scrutiny, the Department of Health announced the first AI-powered medical system to receive national approval under new oversight guidelines. It's named Helix, but not the Helix Hargrave had stolen. The one Julian built, the one meant to protect the people the system always forgot, redesigned with open-source transparency, governed by an ethics board, and required by law to be accountable. Julian didn't speak at the press conference. He stayed at the library that day, drawing diagrams on a wall stained with tape and dreams. He glanced at the students around him, heads down, eyes lit, hands coding something that didn't yet exist. And for the first time since that night on stage, he smiled. Because the real power was never in the machine. It was in who gets to write the code. So let us ask you something. If you had the chance to rewrite one system that hurt you or someone you love, what would you build instead? Tell us in the comments. And don't forget to follow Heart Story, where silence becomes truth and justice finally gets a face.